All right, hello again, you little high school people. Um, in this video, we're going to talk about the adaptive immune system, which is the other arm of the immunity. So we, oh, here we go. All right. So we talked about, right, last video, the innate immunity. And so we talked about how that consists of physical and cellular defenses, and we're going to kind of finish up that little chemical branch today. And then we talked about how it's already there in your body, and so you immediately start to prevent the movement and spread of foreign pathogens throughout the body. And the way that this contrasts to the adaptive arm is that the adaptive arm, I've kind of bolded this, is that there's not really a physical component of the adaptive arm. It's pretty much just cellular and molecular defenses. And then the thing is that the adaptive arm, the reason why it's called adaptive is because it develops to prevent the spread. It's not already there. It's not already ready to go. It has to grow into its role. And so that's kind of how it contrasts to the innate system. So the adaptive arm adapts to whatever the pathogen is in a very complicated kind of system. But again, irregardlessly, it's still immunity, right? So it's still trying to spread and is trying to prevent the spread and movement of these foreign pathogens throughout the body. So yeah, this video we're going to talk about the adaptive arm. And so to do that, we need to talk about that lymphatic system that we talked about last video. The last video we kind of went into the blood and kind of how leukocytes are in the blood, and we talked about how macrophages are in the blood. How neutrophils are in the blood, and they get recruited out, and so that's the importance of the blood in there. But we're going to talk more about the lymphatic system here. And then there's certain cells in the lymphatic system, and they're called lymphoid cells. And there are two different types of lymphoid cells, and that's T cells and B cells. We're going to talk about those. And then we're going to talk about what these cells make, and that is cytokines and antibodies, respectively. Spoiler alert. And then, so then we'll talk about the actual lymph nodes. If you remember those little green nodules that are in your lymphatic system, we'll talk about those. And then how the innate system, right, like macrophages and neutrophils and NK cells, how they talk to the adaptive arm, which are B cells and T cells, and then and how they activate these B cells and T cells, and then we'll wrap it up as what B cells and T cells do for the inflammatory response. So when we talk about that, the first thing we're going to talk about is the lymphatic system. So this should look familiar. You got these little nodes here and these little tubes that are correcting everything. And again, these run parallel to the circulatory system. And so they're little strings and tubes. And the first thing we're going to talk about is that what's inside of these tubes, right? And so what's inside of these things are microbial debris. So what that means is that after a macrophage comes in and eats up bacteria, what it's gonna do, actually, interestingly enough, is it's gonna eat up that bacteria, but instead of like really eating it, what it's kind of throw that up. It's gonna like barf up the bacteria, and it's just gonna release this like chewed up bacteria into your body, and that's going to go into your immune system. It sounds a lot grosser than it actually is. It's like a good thing. It's like, yay for it, you know. And so it's going to release these microbial debris into the lymphatic system. And this microbial This microbial debris is termed an antigen. And so we'll talk about antigens and how they're involved. So you need to kind of know that definition. But what's happened is that throughout this lymphatic system, there's lymphatic cells, or which they call lymphocytes, right? Cells of the lymphatics, right? And so there's two different types, right? And these cells live in these little nodules here, and they are called B cells and T cells. And so we're going to talk about each one of these specifically and kind of how they are different from one another, but have kind of similar characteristics, I guess. And so the first cell we're going to talk about are what's called T cells. And so the reason why they're called T cells is because, and this is, we talked about in that little diagram, is that these cells develop in the thymus. And so thymus starts with T, and so they said, oh, cells that develop in the thymus are called T cells. And so the thymus, what is it? It's a little gland that's right above your heart. And so what happens is you have these cells, they travel to the thymus, and then they grow up to be grown up little T cells. And then once they are fully developed T cells, they then go to the lymph nodes and then start to do what they were made to do. And there are two different types of T cells. The first cell we're going to talk about are what's called a helper T cell. And the second cell is called a cytotoxic T cell. So helper T cells, what they do is they're the kind of first thing to get activated, and they activate these cytotoxic cells that we talk about, and then also these B cells that we're going to talk about next. And so the main role of helper cells is that they activate the adaptive arm of the immune system. And then the second role, and we're not going to go too much about helper T cells. We're going to talk more about cytotoxic T cells. Now, cytotoxic T cells, what they do is they actually go out into the tissue and they go and kill infected cells, or cells that are infected intracellularly. So they're kind of like the NK cells. They're very similar to NK cells, just they are part of the adaptive arm. So NK cells and T cells, they pretty much do the same thing. Just NK cells act immediately in kind of a weaker fashion, while T cells are very, very good at what they do, but they have to kind of grow into their role, and they have to develop, and they have to adapt to the pathogen. So what's distinct about the T cells is that they have this thing called a T cell receptor, and you can see it in this picture here. And what that does is it allows kind of like an anchoring point for these cells to talk to each other. And so it allows helper T cells to talk to both cytotoxic T cells and B cells through this T cell receptor. And it helps cytotoxic T cells come in and recognize infected cells and then do what they do to kind of help kill this layer. And the big thing that T cells do, and actually NK cells as well, is that what they do is they release these molecules called cytokines. And so what a cytokine is, these are proteins. They are a class of proteins that help cells communicate to each other. So if you are a helper T cell, what you're going to be communicating is you're going to be communicating to B cells and cytotoxic T cells to activate. And the way that the helper T cell communicates to these cells are through cytokines. So here you can kind of see a picture of these proteins. This is the ribbon format of this. Here we got IL-6, IL-10, and I think that's IL-2, but it doesn't matter. A lot of these cytokines have ILs. You don't have to know this, but a lot of these cytokines have ILs, which stands for interleukin, and so it's interleukin, and then they give it like this random number that you always got to memorize, and it's always annoying, but you don't have to do that here. You just got to do that when you become like a PhD in immunology, like all y'all are going to be. So eventually, right, so these cytokines help communicate, right? And so helper T cells communicate with B cells and T cells to activate them, but cytotoxic T cells, what they do is they communicate to infected cells through cytokines, and what these cytokines do is they tell the infected cell, hey, kill yourself, apoptose, right, or apoptose, which that's like a little, all right, we're gonna do a sidebar, let's do it. So apoptose is not apoptose. This is like a little pet peeve of mine. A P before a T is not pronounced. So, all right, the word pterodactyl starts with a P and then a T. it's not pterodactyl, it's pterodactyl, and then this P is silent. So it's the same thing for apoptosis, right? It's apoptosis. Well, it's not a P, it's not apoptosis. Whatever, doesn't matter. All right, just live your life, whatever, I don't care. All right, so the next thing we're gonna talk about that's my little TED Talk. That's my little TED Talk for cytokines and apoptosis. All right, so that's the role of T cells, right? So T cells, they secrete cytokines and they either, right, help T cells activate T cells and B cells, while cytotoxic T cells go into the tissue and go in and kill infected cells. B cells are different in that they develop in what's called the bone marrow, and this is like a little fun fact that you can drop on trivia night. So for B cells, they mature in the bone marrow, right? And so the bone marrow is, you may not know this, but bones, yeah, they're like solid all on the outside, but on the inside, they're like, it's like a little like, it's not jello, but it's like, I don't know, it's bone marrow. I don't know. It's just like this, like, I don't know how to describe it. I'm not even gonna pretend. But it's bones are like a hollow, and they have like this kind of like meshwork of, it's like spongy cartilage and stuff. But inside here is actually this like, it's like this substance. It's like gritty. It's almost like, oh, you know what it's like? It's like wet cement. That's what it's like. It's like wet cement inside of here. And so what happens is that your cells, your B cells, what they do is they develop, just like your T cells develop in your thymus, your B cells develop in your bone marrow, and then they travel from your bone marrow to your lymph node. And so they develop in your bone marrow, which starts with a B. They're actually named after this organ called a bursa, but we're not going to talk about that in birds. But so the B actually stands for bursa, but it's a nice mnemonic to remember B cells as bone marrow. But after they travel to the lymph node, what they do is, there's only one type of B cell, and well, that's not, for y'all's intent and purposes, there's only one type of B cell, and what the role of the B cell is to do is to secrete these molecules called antibodies. And so what happens is these helper T cells, right, activate the B cell, which is the helper T cell role. But then once these B cells become activated, they secrete these molecules called antibodies. And we'll talk about more antibodies next slide, but just like how T cells have T cell receptors, B cells have a B cell receptor, and it's kind of different. That's got like a little Y shape rather than a straight on shape. And so, but what happens is that these B cell receptors, what they do is they secrete these B cell receptors, and when a B cell receptor is secreted, it's called an antibody. And B cells are involved in, right, this extracellular pathogen, while cytotoxic T cells are involved in, this is a cytotoxic T cell right here. Cytotoxic T cells are involved in the intracellular response. So B cells secrete, sorry about that. B cells secrete these antibodies, and so the way that antibodies work, so antibodies are also proteins. So they got this structure here. We got this antibody here, and as you can see, there's it kind of forms like a little Y, and so there's a lot of diagrams that depict antibodies as a Y. And when we talk about the structure of the antibody, there's two main functions here. I'll put this over here. This is annoying. I might get rid of this next time. There's two big regions of the antibody, and that's this region called the variable region, which is the antigen binding region. And antigens, right, are these little microbial components, if you remember, right? And so what antibodies do is they actually bind these microbial components, and then through their variable region. There's this other region called the constant region, which for our intent and purposes aren't as important. They are very important, but not for, I'm not going to make y'all like learn that. but these variable regions are what actually bind to the antigen. And there's two very